Hello, everyone. Welcome to Facilitation Skills. I'm Sean Polrice with Faculty Development. This is my disclosure slide. I don't have anything to disclose, and my images are used with permission, with attribution, or are purchased. And as we get into this module, I want you to think about past group work that you've been involved in, and what are some of the things that have made it work well? What's made it successful? Group work has a lot of benefits. You get interpersonal relationships. You have very active learning from the participants, lots of autonomy and lots of problem solving going on, lots of benefits. And we want to make sure that the groups function as well as possible. So the objectives for this module are firstly to create positive learning environments, second to be able to monitor and manage the content, and third to monitor and manage interpersonal group dynamics. And we are talking for this module of basic general principles for facilitating any group. And that might be team-based learning, case-based learning, problem-based learning, basically any group that you're going to be facilitating. I think these are some of the skills that are generalizable across the board. So we'll start with creating positive learning environments. And I'll start with a Dilbert comic. And as you can see here, that's Dilbert's boss who's kind of running the show. By what he's saying and his nonverbal communication, it's not creating a very positive environment at all. And so that hopefully will get us thinking about some of the things we can do that are the opposite of essentially what Dilbert's boss is doing. And I've got some suggestions along the way. So the first is to build rapport with your learners. Arrive early and be friendly and welcoming. So if that means going to the room 5 to 10 minutes in advance, getting set up so that when they come in, you can have a quick chat with them, get to know them a little bit, get to start knowing their interests and a little bit about their background. If it's online, sign in early and get set up early so that as soon as somebody joins, you can say hi, welcome, find out a little bit about them. Do some introductions, use names as much as you can. It's really important for rapport and really personalizing the entire encounter. And you can use name cards, name tags, name tents that you use on the table sometimes. I like to use, typically I create a diagram ahead of time of the table or the configuration of the room, and then I write the names down around so that I know where everybody is sitting, and that way I can use their names and get to know them. If it's the first time meeting with a group or if they haven't met for a while, I think an icebreaker is a really good idea. There's a Word document that's attached to the resources in this module that has a whole list of icebreakers, many to choose from. I have a few rules with my icebreakers. I like them to be nice and easy, very interesting, and a lot of fun. So nothing that's difficult or makes people too uneasy. I don't find that that's necessarily a real good way to do an icebreaker. These are my rules. You don't have to follow them, but I find that they create a really good learning environment right off the bat. You need to also establish the roles. And what I'm talking about in terms of roles is your role and the students or learners in the room. The small group teaching is learner-centered. It's all about the learners working typically through cases or problems, essentially. You are not the center of attention, or you shouldn't be. If you are, there's probably something going wrong. So you want to be clear that you're the facilitator, the guide, and you're there to help move things along, but not to give all the answers. That's something that they should be doing. And similarly then, the opposite, the student role, they are to be the active participants in the learning process. So they shouldn't always be looking to you. They should be asking each other questions. They should be doing problem solving. They're the ones creating the learning, essentially, and solving the problems. So that's their role. Your role is to help with that process. So everybody should be clear with that. You need to create safe space for learning. And a lot of people call these ground rules. I'm not a big fan of ground rules. It's kind of a little bit juvenile, but you can also call them expectations or guiding principles, something like that. But ground rules is fine. but you need to have some established kind of requirements for the behavior of the group, essentially. On the next slide, I've got a little bit of an activity for you to do, and you might want to use some of my ideas on this slide. These are just some of the things that I think are good ideas to encourage for groups to do, to make sure that the space is safe for learning. So everybody's listening to everybody else. Everyone gets a chance to share. All ideas are welcome and they're separated from the person who gave the idea. There's shared decision making, not one person doing it all. And we use mistakes for learning. So these are some of my kind of ground rules, and you might want to borrow or modify some of these. Now, some people have a bit of an issue with the word safe because some people equate safe spaces with comfortable spaces. And learning doesn't always take place in a comfortable space. Sometimes there's some uncomfortable times during group discussion, and that's okay. And that's what Brave Spaces gets at. And so what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to read the paper, and it'll be linked below. It'll be a resource below. And what I want you to do is read that paper, and with the ideas that you take out of that paper, as well as some of the things I mentioned on the last slide, I want you to come up with your own list, kind of a ground rules for facilitating a small group that I'm going to take in as principles. Now, this isn't necessarily a list that you will impose on every group that you facilitate, but it's a list maybe that you will use as a kind of a guide when you have discussions about creating ground rules. So I think it's good for us to have kind of an idea going in of what are some of the things that we need to pay attention to, and then create that with the learning group. And so I think it's very helpful to do this activity ahead of time. So if you want, you can pause the recording and read the article and come up with your ground rules set. That would be great. If you want to just go on with the last two sections of this module and then revisit that, that is perfectly fine. Okay, the second thing besides the learning environment is monitoring and managing the content. So essentially what the learners need to take out of it, what they need to come away with. And it's important that at the start that everybody understands what the learning objectives are. So what is it we need to achieve here? Do we have to come up with, a patient care plan, for example? By the end of this, we need to have a patient care plan that includes X, Y, and Z. Just make sure that everybody is clear on that at the start. If everybody's clear on that, it'll be easier to go back to it as well later on. As a facilitator, you need to keep them on track as well. So if they're going a little bit off the rails and talking about something that's kind of irrelevant, it might be up to you to kind of bring them back. Okay, remember we're talking about patient X here, and that's where we need to focus. And a third thing that I think in terms of content is pacing. You want to make sure that they're not going too slow, and so you're just about out of time and they're only halfway through the case. And you also want to make sure they're not going too fast and just treating some ideas very superficially. You want them to make sure that they're having good discussions about everything that's important in the case. And so sometimes you might need to slow them down. And one of the ways you do most of these activities is through questioning. The facilitator's main strategy is asking effective questions. And I've got this cartoon on here to kind of get you thinking a little bit about closed-ended versus open-ended questions. And you can see by this cartoon some of the limits of a closed-ended question. This is a closed-ended question. There's only one answer. And it doesn't really tell you a lot about whether or not the students can solve problems at all. It just tells you whether or not they can remember that pi r squared is equal to area. So if they remember that, that's great, but it doesn't really tell you a whole bunch. So closed-ended questions, while sometimes being useful, don't provide nearly as much information or as much value as an open-ended question will. So how do I know my questions are effective? I think if your questions do any of the things mentioned in these first 2 points, that's a hint that your question has been effective. So if it helps to diagnose what the learners need, so it helps you find out some gaps, that would be a good question. If you can encourage them to further problem solve and rationalize what they're thinking of or reflect on something that they've done, Those are good types of questions. So these are good purposes of questions. What are some examples? So here are 5 different examples, and there's myriad of variations of these types of questions. But these are ways of getting the student to further kind of explain or consider other options and that kind of thing. Always be probing. You're always asking them, okay, so why do you think that? Can you justify that? Why wasn't it this? Or why did you rule out, that condition? Uh, all of those types of questions are the ones that are going to really get them thinking and solving problems, questioning, what they've come up with, and those are all really, really valuable. I will mention before leaving this area, though, that sometimes as a facilitator, your job might be to clarify something that they're getting wrong, or they just have, an incorrect assumption about something, or they're confused. You for sure can step in with some clarification. It's not that you can't, it's just that typically it's good if you can get them to resolve any issues like that through effective questioning. But by all means, if you need to move things along and clear something up, feel free to do that. So effective questioning is your go-to strategy for maintaining and managing the content of your session. Finally, interpersonal group dynamics. So that's another thing that you also have to monitor and sometimes manage. You need to maintain that safe / brave space that we talked about. Sometimes that means reminding them of some of the maybe ground rules that you came up with, or coming back to them. You need to control a little bit who's speaking and how much they're speaking. Now, it's not that everybody in every group has to speak equal amounts. Some people just will talk a little bit more and some will talk a little bit less. That is totally fine. But if somebody's being left out completely, the facilitator's job is to bring them in. So you might want to say, okay, we haven't heard from Sean for a while. Sean, what do you make of this, or what do you think of what Bob said? So you might have to get them involved a little bit. Conversely, you might have to control a little bit some of the more extroverted or assertive people who are talking a lot, and it's not necessarily their fault. It just might be that's who they are, and if there's empty space, they fill it. So you might have to ask them to, okay, well, hang on a second, let's hear from somebody else for this one. So you might have to do a little bit of that, just making sure that participation is coming from everywhere. Some silence is okay, especially for the introverts and people that are a little bit shyer. They need sometimes a little bit of space and time to interject. So some silence is fine. And when you give feedback to the group, make sure it's positive, it's very specific, and given in a constructive way that they can use it to further along the group process. So challenges might arise, and we're not going to get into every possible challenge you might face. I'm going to be very brief here. I just have a few suggestions for if conflict does arise, and conflict can take a lot of different forms, but let's say some conflict arises. Don't avoid the conflict, talk about it. Say, okay, we seem to have an issue here. Let's talk about it, and make sure you clear the air, and don't just sweep it under the carpet, because it's probably just going to cause some problems down the line. Be objective. Again, there's no blame. Let's just talk about this and what we need to do to make the group function better or more productively. Get the group to discuss how to resolve the issue. They're adult learners. They'll probably have lots of good ideas for that. And at all times, there's zero tolerance for personal attacks. That is simply unprofessional and unacceptable, which leads me to my last point. If there is a serious professionalism issue, that may need to be discussed one-on-one or even taken to a higher authority. And I'm not going to get into all of that, but certainly that will derail probably the group process and any constructiveness that's going on in your problem solving. So that needs to be addressed, but might need to be addressed outside of the group. But hopefully, for the most part, most of it can be discussed, and you can come to conclusions and closure with group discussion. So hopefully you don't encounter too much of that. I think for the most part with your learners, you likely won't. The last thing before I sum up, I want to encourage you to reflect on your facilitation. Ask yourself some of these questions. What went well? What didn't go well? Was everybody involved and engaged? Did I include everyone? Did we actually achieve what we were supposed to? Did I get some feedback from them, either directly or maybe indirectly, that I can use for next time? And then make a little bit of a plan for next time. What are some things that you might want to continue doing that went really well? And is there anything else that you might want to alter and add to what you're doing as a facilitator that might make your group work even better next time? So, a quick summary. The facilitator has, I think, three broad jobs. And one is to ensure that the learning environment is positive. And so we talked about that safe, brave learning space, and you need to maintain that throughout and maybe have some kind of ground rules for behaviors within the group. The second job is to make sure that you progress through the content, and effective questioning is kind of your go-to strategy. So have a look at the facilitator resources ahead of time. Typically, you will have some sample questions in there. Or with the content, if you don't, start thinking about some things that this would be a good question to ask. And what could I ask here? And even jot down a few questions ahead of time. It'll help you out when you're in the group. And the third job is to manage and maintain positive group dynamics. And diplomacy and clarity are the two words I decided to use here. Be upfront, be clear, be objective, have a discussion with them as adults, because they are. And I think most group conflicts will resolve, and you won't have any large issues, hopefully. So with that, I want to thank everyone for your involvement. If you haven't done the little activity with Brave Spaces, please go do it now. This is where we can be found with faculty development. Again, I'm Sean Polrice. I want to thank you very much for teaching in the college and for joining for the module. Best of luck, and hope to see you soon.